Have you ever noticed that the loudest emotional moments in a person's life almost never happen in front of other people? They happen in silence. They happen behind a locked door, inside a parked car after everyone has gone home, or in the middle of the night when there is nobody left to impress. Human beings are remarkably good at performing strength during the day. They answer messages with smiling emojis. They laugh at jokes they don't actually find funny. They tell everyone they're doing fine because it's easier than explaining everything that has been building inside them for months. Then, when the world finally becomes quiet, the emotions they've been negotiating with all day stop asking for permission. They arrive all at once. Most people imagine crying as a reaction to pain. In reality, people often cry because clarity finally arrives. Pain creates pressure. Clarity releases it. That's an important difference. Someone can survive heartbreak for months without shedding a tear. They can survive rejection. They can survive disappointment. They can even survive betrayal while appearing completely composed. Then one ordinary evening, something happens that seems insignificant from the outside. A familiar song starts playing in the background. They find an old photograph while cleaning a drawer. They read one sentence that reminds them of a conversation they thought they had forgotten. Suddenly the tears begin. Not because that single moment was powerful enough to break them, because it was finally powerful enough to connect every unfinished thought into one undeniable realization. The human brain spends an incredible amount of energy protecting us from conclusions we'll reality emotionally ready to accept. Hope delays certainty. Hope whispers that maybe tomorrow will be different. Maybe they were just busy. Maybe they didn't mean what they said. Maybe the distance is temporary. Maybe one more conversation will fix everything. Hope isn't the enemy. It's one of the reasons people survive difficult seasons. But hope has another side. It can keep someone emotionally invested in a version of reality that no longer exists. There comes a moment when evidence quietly outweighs imagination. Nothing dramatic has to happen. Nobody has to confess anything. There isn't always a final argument or an unforgettable betrayal. Sometimes the truth arrives through repetition. The message that never comes. The promises that slowly disappear. The conversations that become shorter every week. The effort that quietly becomes one-sided. People rarely cry because of one unanswered message. They cry because that message becomes impossible to separate from 50 others. Behavior forms patterns. Patterns become conclusions. Conclusions change lives. If you've ever watched someone slowly lose hope, you've probably noticed something strange. They don't become emotional immediately. In many cases, they become calmer. From the outside, everyone assumes they're finally moving on. Inside, something entirely different is happening. They're running out of explanations. And explanations are what keep emotional attachment alive. As long as the mind can explain another person's behavior, it can postpone acceptance. They're overwhelmed. They've been under pressure. They're afraid. They don't know how to communicate. Those explanations aren't always wrong. Sometimes they're completely accurate. The problem begins when every piece of evidence must be forced to fit the same hopeful narrative. The mind becomes less interested in discovering the truth than preserving the story it wants to believe. That's when emotional exhaustion begins. Not because loving someone is exhausting, because protecting an illusion requires constant mental effort. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack every day. At first you barely notice the weight. Your body adjusts. Your muscles compensate. Eventually you convince yourself that this is simply what walking feels like. Then one day you take the backpack off. The relief surprises you. Not because the backpack became heavier, because you'd forgotten what normal felt like. Relationships can work the same way. Someone spends so much time defending inconsistency, justifying silence, minimizing disappointment, and lowering expectations that emotional strain begins to feel ordinary. Then one evening they stop defending it. Nothing changes outside. Everything changes inside. That's the night many people cry. Not because they became weaker, because they stopped carrying something that was never theirs to carry. Behavioral psychology teaches us something fascinating about attention. The things we repeatedly excuse eventually become invisible. Think about living near a train track. The first week, every passing train grabs your attention. A month later, your brain barely notices the sound. The same adaptation happens emotionally. A canceled promise feels painful. The 10th canceled promise feels normal. Not because it hurts less, because your brain has stopped expecting reliability. Lower expectations create temporary comfort. They also create invisible loss. Without realizing it, people begin celebrating the bare minimum. A simple reply feels extraordinary. Basic kindness feels exceptional. One thoughtful conversation erases months of inconsistency. That's not emotional balance. That's emotional scarcity. Scarcity changes perception. If you've ever been extremely thirsty, even ordinary water tastes incredible. The water didn't change. Your level of deprivation did. Attention works exactly the same way. Someone who receives affection only occasionally often values it more than someone who receives it consistently. This creates one of the most misunderstood emotional experiences in relationships. Intensity. People mistake intensity for depth. They're not the same thing. Depth grows through consistency. Intensity often grows through uncertainty. Think about waiting for an important phone call. Every vibration captures your attention. Every notification increases anticipation. When the call finally arrives, your emotional response feels enormous. The intensity came from waiting, not necessarily from the conversation itself. Relationships built around unpredictability create similar emotional highs. The reunion feels magical because the absence created hunger, but hunger should never be confused with nourishment. A starving person appreciates food more intensely than someone who eats regularly. That doesn't mean starvation is healthy. The same principle applies emotionally. Someone can become addicted to relief without realizing they've been living in unnecessary anxiety. Real love rarely requires emotional survival. It creates emotional stability. There's another moment that often happens before someone cries alone. They begin remembering details they ignored before. Not because new information appeared, because old information finally makes sense. The memory of being interrupted every time they tried to express their feelings. The forgotten birthday that was explained away as being busy. The promises that were always postponed until next week. The conversations where they apologized for problems they didn't create. At the time, each moment seemed isolated. Months later, they connect into one unmistakable pattern. The human brain is extraordinary at recognizing patterns after emotion stops interfering with observation. That's why people often say, "I should have seen it sooner." The truth is, they probably did. They just weren't ready to believe what they were seeing. Love has an interesting effect on perception. It doesn't usually make people blind. It makes them optimistic. Optimism is beautiful when it inspires growth. It's dangerous when it consistently overrides evidence. There's a reason investigators rarely base conclusions on one event. They look for repeated behavior. One contradiction means very little. 20 contradictions deserve attention. Healthy relationships don't require constant investigation, because consistency produces confidence naturally. When consistency disappears, people often replace observation with imagination. Imagination is incredibly persuasive. It fills empty spaces with stories. Sometimes those stories protect us. Sometimes they trap us. The evening someone finally cries is often the evening imagination loses its argument. Evidence quietly wins. No announcement is made. No dramatic speech is delivered. Just a silent realization that the relationship they've been fighting for exists mostly inside their own expectations, rather than in the repeated behavior their back actually experienced. And once that realization arrives, it becomes almost impossible to return to the version of reality they believed only hours before. The strange thing about acceptance is that it almost never announces itself. There isn't always a dramatic conversation or a life-changing event that signals its arrival. More often, it enters quietly, like the first hint of daylight before sunrise. Nothing outside has changed yet, but inside, something irreversible has begun. For weeks, months, or even years, a person can spend enormous amounts of mental energy trying to solve a relationship that no longer behaves like one. Every unanswered question becomes another puzzle. Every mixed signal becomes another clue. Every brief moment of warmth becomes proof that the connection is still alive. The mind naturally searches for patterns that support what it hopes is true. That's not weakness. It's how people protect themselves from overwhelming loss. When someone matters deeply, the brain doesn't rush toward painful conclusions. It searches for alternatives first. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they're afraid of commitment. Maybe they don't know how to express themselves. Maybe tomorrow will be different. Hope is remarkably creative. It can build entire futures from very little evidence. The problem begins when reality quietly stops contributing to that future. One of the most revealing moments in any relationship isn't when someone says they care. It's when caring becomes inconvenient. Words are inexpensive. Consistency requires time. Attention requires intention. Presence requires sacrifice. Those things cannot be created by good intentions alone. They appear through repeated choices. Imagine watching someone water a plant every single day. You wouldn't question whether they wanted it to survive. Their behavior already answered the question. Now imagine someone insisting they care deeply about the same plant while forgetting about it, week after week. Eventually, the leaves tell the truth more clearly than the promises ever could. Relationships are similar. People often listen to declarations while ignoring outcomes. But outcomes are where priorities become visible. A person who cried alone last night may not have been mourning the end of a relationship. They may have been mourning the end of an explanation. There comes a point where every new excuse sounds almost identical to the last one. The details change. The result never does. Another canceled plan. Another broken promise. Another apology followed by the same behavior. Eventually the mind stops asking, "Why did this happen?" It starts asking a different question. What if this is exactly who they are? That question changes everything, because it shifts attention away from potential and toward reality. People fall in love with possibility all the time. Possibility is exciting because it has no limits. Reality asks harder questions. Who are they when they're tired? Who are they when they're stressed? Who are they when nobody is watching? Who are they when choosing you requires effort instead of convenience? Character doesn't appear during perfect moments. It becomes visible when circumstances stop being perfect. That's why repeated behavior deserves more attention than occasional emotion. Almost anyone can create a beautiful moment. Fewer people can create a dependable pattern. Dependability isn't glamorous. It rarely becomes the subject of movies or dramatic stories. Yet it's the foundation that allows trust to grow. Without trust, affection becomes negotiation. Without consistency, reassurance becomes temporary. Without honesty, hope slowly transforms into confusion. Confusion has a unique effect on decision-making. It convinces people that if they could just understand one more detail, everything would finally make sense. So they replay conversations. They analyze messages. They remember tiny expressions. They search for hidden meaning. Meanwhile, the simplest explanation quietly waits in the background. Sometimes there is no mystery. Sometimes repeated behavior is simply revealing repeated priorities. That realization can feel devastating because it removes the final reason to keep waiting. Waiting often feels productive. Acceptance feels final. Yet acceptance is also where emotional freedom begins. Not because the pain disappears immediately, because energy is no longer spent defending what reality has already demonstrated. Many people describe this moment as feeling strangely peaceful and heartbreaking at the same time. Both emotions can exist together. Grief and relief often arrive as companions. Grief for the future that was imagined. Relief from carrying uncertainty that never seemed to end. Those tears are rarely about one evening. They're about every evening that came before it. Every conversation rehearsed in advance. Every message read multiple times. Every promise believed, because believing felt easier than letting go. Eventually something inside becomes still, not empty, still. And in that stillness, the relationship is finally seen without constant negotiation between hope and evidence. That's why clarity can be so emotional. It asks people to release not only another person, but also the version of the future they built around them. That kind of loss isn't measured in days. It's measured in expectations that will never become memories. Yet there is something quietly powerful about that moment as well. The same clarity that ends an illusion also creates room for something healthier. When someone no longer has to explain away inconsistency, they begin recognizing consistency. When they stop chasing unpredictable attention, they begin appreciating reliable presence. When they stop measuring love by intensity alone, they begin noticing the calm confidence that genuine care creates. Those changes don't happen overnight, but they begin with one honest realization. Not every connection that feels powerful is healthy. Not every relationship that creates butterflies creates peace. And not everyone who says the right words has built a life that reflects them. Long before someone else recognizes those truths, the person living through them often discovers them alone, in the quiet, with nobody there to witness the moment everything finally starts making sense. People often believe that healing begins when the pain disappears. In reality, healing usually begins while the pain is still present. The difference is that the pain is no longer controlling every decision. For a long time, every choice revolved around preserving the connection. Every conversation was carefully measured. Every disagreement was softened. Every disappointment was minimized. Not because the experiences weren't significant, but because acknowledging their full weight threatened the future that had been imagined. There is an interesting shift that happens once someone stops fighting reality. They begin noticing things that once seemed ordinary. Silence no longer feels mysterious. It feels informative. Distance no longer feels like a puzzle waiting to be solved. It becomes part of the answer. Promises stop sounding impressive by themselves. Instead, they are quietly compared against actions. This is one of the most valuable changes a person can experience. Attention moves away from intentions and toward patterns. Patterns are difficult to argue with because they develop over time. Anyone can surprise you for a day. Character reveals itself across months. That's why consistency is so powerful. It removes the need for constant interpretation. You no longer have to guess whether someone values your presence. Their repeated behavior answers that question long before they ever speak about it. Many people discover that they weren't actually afraid of losing the relationship. They were afraid of losing the version of themselves that existed inside it. The planner, the encourager, the person who always believed one more conversation could fix everything. Letting go can feel like abandoning that identity. But identities can change. What remains is the ability to carry the lessons forward without carrying the weight. Eventually, conversations become easier. Not because every memory has faded, but because those memories stop demanding explanations. The mind no longer revisits the same moments searching for hidden meaning. Instead, it files them where they belong, as experiences that shaped better judgment. One day, someone asks about the relationship. You tell the story without your voice changing. You remember the good moments without pretending they erased the difficult ones. You acknowledge the difficult ones without allowing them to define every memory. That balance is a quiet form of freedom. It doesn't erase what happened. It simply places it in its proper perspective. Looking back, the tears from that night begin to make sense. They weren't proof that everything had fallen apart. They were proof that denial had finally loosened its grip. Sometimes the hardest truth isn't that another person changed. It's realizing they had been showing you who they were all along, and hope kept translating their actions into something easier to accept. Once that translation stops, reality becomes clearer. Clarity can feel sharp at first. Then, over time, it becomes steady, and from that steadiness comes something far more valuable than certainty about another person. It becomes confidence in your own ability to recognize the difference between words that sound convincing and actions that remain dependable, between temporary emotional intensity and lasting emotional security, between being chosen in moments of convenience and being valued through moments that require patience, effort, honesty, and care.